Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to the Middle Ages, that long stretch of time when knights were supposedly noble, kings were supposedly wise, and peasants were supposedly happy to wallow in mud. Of course, very little of that is true. The knights were violent mercenaries with better outfits. Kings were often inbred and constantly sulking, and peasants had opinions, though no one in power particularly cared. But tonight we're going to focus on something smaller, not castles, not plagues, not wars, something as simple as hands. Specifically, the unfortunate souls who happened to be born left-handed in an era when superstition ruled daily life. So, let's get comfortable. Dim the lights, let the day sink into the background. And imagine yourself in a medieval village where even something as innocent as picking up a spoon with your left hand could earn you suspicious glances, or worse. Now, we need to remember that left-handedness has always been in the minority. Roughly 1 in 10 people across history seem to have been naturally left-handed, which makes it one of those quiet genetic quirks that pops up everywhere, from Roman gladiators to medieval bakers. And yet, if you were unlucky enough to live in certain times and places, that natural quirk wasn't just inconvenient. It was dangerous. Because, in the medieval imagination, the left hand wasn't just another hand. It was sinister. Literally. That's not me being dramatic. That's the actual etymology. The Latin word for left is sinistra, which slowly evolved into the English word sinister. Not the best PR campaign if you happen to be left-handed. Meanwhile, the right hand had far better branding. Right wasn't just the direction, it was also correct, proper, moral, and blessed. A medieval priest could stand at the pulpit and talk about how Christ sat at the right hand of God, while the goats, sinners, and the generally disappointing were pushed off to the left. And there you were, trying to stir your porridge with your apparently cursed hand. We don't have medieval statistics about left-handedness, of course. Medieval people didn't exactly conduct sociological surveys, but we do know they noticed it, and they were suspicious. Superstitions clung to the left side like mud to boots. Waking up on your left side? Bad luck. Putting your left shoe on first? Very bad luck. Starting a journey by stepping off with your left foot? You may as well stay home. So if you happen to favor your left hand, people assumed there was something off about you. Perhaps you were touched by the devil. Perhaps you were simply clumsy. Or perhaps, as many schoolmasters thought, you just needed a little encouragement to stop. And by encouragement, of course, I mean physical punishment. Naturally, they made it worse. Now, it wasn't just the church fueling this bias. Everyday practicality played a role, too. Most tools and weapons were designed for right-handed people. Shields strapped to the left arm, swords gripped in the right. A left-handed knight on the battlefield could cause chaos simply by throwing off the rhythm of combat, which sounds exciting, but mostly meant he was seen as awkward and untrustworthy. If you were a left-handed scribe, which, statistically, a few unlucky souls must have been, you had an even harder time. Medieval scribes wrote with quill pens and ink that smeared easily. Writing left-handed meant dragging your hand across wet ink, smudging the manuscript and enraging the monastery librarian, who probably already hated you for other reasons. So what happened? In many cases, left-handed children were trained, scolded, or outright beaten into using their right hands. Parents didn't want their child marked as odd, or worse, suspiciously devilish. Better to break the habit early than let little Jeffrey grow up drawing pentagrams accidentally. simply because he held the chalk wrong. And then, of course, there was the legal system. Because nothing says weird medieval logic quite like the way courts treated left-handedness. In trial by combat, which was, yes, a genuine medieval method of proving innocence, you were expected to fight right-handed. A left-handed fighter could be accused of cheating. It gave you an unfair advantage since your movements confused your opponent. If you won while left-handed, people whispered that the devil himself must have guided your blade. If you lost, well, you probably didn't have much more whispering to worry about. It wasn't all doom and gloom, though. In some rare cases, left-handed warriors were prized precisely because they were so unexpected. In a sea of right-handed fighters, their strikes came from the opposite angle. But let's be honest, most of them didn't get statues built in their honor. They probably just got strange looks at dinner. And then there's the world of magic and folklore. Medieval Europe adored linking everything to the supernatural. The left hand became associated with witches, demons, and curses. To make the connection painfully obvious, witches were sometimes accused of giving the left-hand path to their followers, a phrase that is carried on into modern occultism. The left-hand path essentially meant the darker, forbidden road of magic, compared to the respectable, church-approved right-hand path, which raises the awkward question of whether all the poor, naturally left-handed folks were just doomed to be viewed as closet sorcerers. Some were, especially women, because medieval Europe had a particular fondness for accusing women of witchcraft for almost anything. Left-handedness was just another little checkbox on the list of suspicions. Now, let's wander into everyday life again. Imagine a medieval feast. Everyone is crammed on benches at a long wooden table. Trenchers of bread act as plates. Stews and roasted meats are passed along. Everyone eats with their right hand, or at least pretends to. And there you are, reaching in with your left hand, bumping elbows, and drawing frowns from your neighbors. Table etiquette mattered. Using the wrong hand wasn't just odd, it was rude. Even shaking hands was an issue. The right hand was offered in greeting to show you weren't carrying a weapon. Offer your left, and people assumed you were either concealing a dagger or just being insulting. Neither was a good start to a friendship. So, to return to our opening question, what actually happened to left-handed people in the Middle Ages? Most of the time, nothing dramatic. They weren't universally burned at the stake or exiled to lonely towers. But life was harder. They were nudged, scolded, and pressured into conformity. Children were forced to switch hands. Adults learned to hide their natural tendencies. And behind every little gesture, the way you signed your name, the way you raised your sword, lurking suspicion. Some slipped under the radar, some were mocked, and some probably leaned into the strangeness and became exactly the eccentric neighbor everyone thought they were. But overall, being left-handed in the Middle Ages was less a personal trait and more a lifelong inconvenience that marked you as ever so slightly suspicious, forever on the edge of respectability. And with that thought, let's drift gently onward to the next royal fiasco waiting for us in history's long, dim corridors. Hey everyone, let's drift further along tonight's path, away from suspicious left-handed villagers, and into the life of another group of people you probably wouldn't have wanted as neighbors. Executioners. Now, executioners were very much a part of medieval and early modern society. They were necessary, they were feared, and unsurprisingly, they were despised. Imagine being hired to do a job everyone insists must be done, then having the same people cross the street to avoid you at the market. That's the life of the medieval hangman. Executioners were official professionals appointed by kings, lords, or city governments. They were responsible for beheadings, hangings, burnings, quarterings, and every other creative punishment dreamed up by the justice system. And because executions were public, part legal proceeding, part theater, executioners were essentially performers. Their mistakes were remembered, their technique was judged, and their reputations stuck. Take beheadings. A clean strike meant a sigh of relief for the crowd. A messy one, where the poor victim needed multiple blows, earned the executioner a permanent reputation for incompetence, which, ironically, did not make people any friendlier to him in daily life. He was still avoided, but now also mocked. So, did they have normal lives after work? The short answer, not really. Executioners lived in a strange limbo. Officially, they were necessary servants of the law. Unofficially, they were social outcasts. They were often forbidden from living in respectable parts of town. Some cities even designated special houses, often near the edge of the walls, where the executioner's family had to reside, conveniently close to the gallows, but inconveniently far from any semblance of a social life. Children of executioners inherited the stigma. People assumed the profession ran in families, which in many cases it did. Not because the children wanted to grow up wielding axes and ropes, but because no one else would employ them. You could be the son of an executioner with a perfectly good set of skills in carpentry, and yet doors would quietly close in your face. Society had decided your destiny, and it involved bloodstains. And then there's the everyday problem of shopping. Imagine walking into the marketplace after you've just publicly dismembered someone's cousin. Suddenly the fishmonger doesn't want to sell you herring. The baker claims he's out of bread. Even the innkeeper would rather you take your thirst somewhere else. Executioners often had to send family members, usually wives or daughters, to shop on their behalf because they were less recognizable. But even they weren't free of whispers. The phrase hangman's daughter became a slur, as though one's parents' profession was hereditary sin. Now, ironically, executioners were sometimes well paid. Cities needed them and needed them to stay, which meant salaries, exemptions from certain taxes, and sometimes even free lodging. A few lucky ones earned small fortunes, especially in periods of frequent executions. But money didn't erase the stigma. You could buy fine clothes, but still no one would sit next to you at church. And about church, that was awkward too. Executioners were often banned from receiving sacraments or forced to sit apart from the congregation, which must have been quite the experience. On the one hand, you're working for the authorities. On the other, the same authorities are reminding you that your soul might be in danger because of it. Medieval hypocrisy at its finest. But here's the strange twist. While society despised executioners, they also needed them for other, more practical tasks. Executioners became a sort of all-purpose municipal handyman. If you needed a dead animal removed from the street, the executioner did it. If a butcher couldn't be found to slaughter livestock, the executioner stepped in. He might also be called upon to clean sewers, remove human waste, or dispose of diseased corpses during plague years. This is one of history's odd ironies. People wouldn't shake the hangman's hand, but they were quite content to have him clean up the city's filth, which, as you might imagine, did little to improve his social standing. And what about their private lives? Marriage was complicated. Many executioners married into other executioner families, not out of romantic destiny, but because respectable households refused the match. The social stigma was contagious, so families tried to keep it contained. Over generations, this created little dynasties of hangmen, where the trade was passed down like an heirloom nobody really wanted. And yet, there were moments of bizarre celebrity. Some executioners gained fame for their skill or their dramatic flair. In France, the Sanson family executed kings, queens, and revolutionaries for nearly 2 centuries, becoming a grim sort of dynasty in their own right. The German executioner Franz Schmidt kept meticulous diaries of his 300-plus executions in the 16th century, detailing everything from decapitations to the occasional reprieve. Reading them today, you get the sense that he was oddly proud of his craft, despite the isolation it brought. So, to return to our gentle question, did executioners have normal lives after work? Not really. Their work followed them everywhere. At home, they lived on society's edges. In markets, they were shunned. At church, they were segregated. Their families inherited the same burdens, and yet they remained essential. Without them, the law could not function. It's one of those enduring contradictions of history. The people who kept order, who made the system work, were treated as untouchable, respected for their skill, feared for their role, and avoided at every opportunity. So, no, executioners didn't exactly have normal lives. They had necessary lives, which in the medieval world was about as close as they were going to get. And with that, let's quietly set aside the hangman's axe, wipe our boots, and drift toward yet another peculiar corner of history's long, drowsy gallery. Hey everyone, let's drift away from the lonely houses of medieval executioners and settle instead into the tiled bathhouses of ancient Rome, a world of marble columns, running water, and communal toilets. Yes, tonight's question is a gentle one, though not particularly glamorous. What did people in ancient Rome use instead of toilet paper? Because here's the spoiler. They didn't have toilet paper, which meant they had to get creative. The Romans prided themselves on their civilization. They built aqueducts. They invented concrete. They laid out perfectly straight roads that still survive today. They also built public latrines, long rows of stone seats with holes cut into them, lined up side by side with no dividers. Imagine 20 strangers, shoulder to shoulder, discussing politics while tending to business. For the Romans, this was perfectly normal. For us, it's a nightmare scenario usually reserved for bad dreams or cheap campgrounds. And after finishing their work, Romans didn't reach for a roll of charmin. Instead, they used a tool charmingly known as the tersorium, a sponge attached to a stick. Now, before you picture a fresh personal sponge, let's clarify. The tersorium was communal. Yes, one sponge, many users. You finished, you rinsed it in a bucket of vinegar or salty water, and then you left it for the next person. It's the kind of system that sounds efficient on paper, but in practice makes you want to politely decline Roman hospitality forever. The vinegar bucket, by the way, was thought to disinfect the sponge, which might have been moderately true. But given the rate at which intestinal parasites thrived in the Roman world, let's just say it wasn't perfect. And this wasn't the only method. Wealthier Romans sometimes used bits of wool or strips of cloth. The poor often relied on whatever nature provided, handfuls of leaves, tufts of grass, even pebbles. Archaeologists have found evidence that shards of broken pottery called pissoi in Greek, were also used. Imagine finishing your day with a jagged terracotta scrape. Nothing says civilization quite like that. Of course, using pottery shards came with risks. Hemorrhoids were a known problem. Ancient medical writers described them with alarming detail, which is how we know they existed. Unsurprising, really, if half your hygiene routine involved sharp clay. Now, the communal latrines themselves were a sort of Roman social club. Men sat in rows, chatting while relieving themselves. Archaeological evidence shows that some toilets were beautifully decorated with mosaics on the floor and marble seats, because apparently even communal bathrooms had to demonstrate Roman superiority. Privacy, however, was not a Roman virtue. Part of being civilized, in their view, meant doing everything in public: eating, bathing, exercising, and yes, this. If you wanted privacy, you were more likely to be mocked for being barbarian. Civilization meant communal sponges. There's even a famous story from the 1st century CE, recorded by Seneca, about a German gladiator who chose death over Roman hygiene. He was imprisoned, awaiting his fight in the arena. And instead of waiting to be killed, he seized a sponge stick from the latrine and shoved it down his own throat, choking himself to death. A tragic but also very specific review of the Tersorium. Of course, not everyone in Rome was enthusiastic about this setup. Satirists made fun of it. Juvenal, the poet famous for mocking Roman life, once described the horrors of sitting in public latrines, where the filth below sometimes splashed upward. Not exactly the spa-like experience the architects promised. And then there's the danger of rats and snakes. Sewers connected to the toilets, and the sewers in turn connected to the wider city, which meant every so often something decidedly unfriendly might crawl up and surprise an unlucky Roman. Imagine sitting there, deep in conversation, when a sewer rat suddenly decided to join. So, did Romans ever invent something closer to toilet paper? Not really. Even in wealthy households, cloth or wool was expensive. You didn't just toss it after one use. It had to be washed. Which means, yes, someone, usually a slave, was tasked with cleaning it. Civilization, again, was built on someone else doing the unpleasant parts. And for most people, it was the sponge stick, the vinegar bucket, and the faint hope that you wouldn't be the first one to use it that morning. It's worth remembering, though, that Romans considered themselves far more advanced than the so-called barbarians beyond their borders. And in some ways, they were. Running water, aqueducts, and sewer systems really were remarkable achievements. But when it came to hygiene, their pride hides a certain irony. While they mocked outsiders as dirty and primitive, they were happily passing around the same communal sponge. So, what did people in ancient Rome use instead of toilet paper? Sponges, stones, leaves, and sometimes sheer optimism. Civilization is complicated like that. And now, let's quietly rinse our hands in that communal vinegar bucket, metaphorically, of course, and drift onward to our next curious corner of history. Hey everyone, let's drift now from Roman latrines to something equally fragrant: medieval peasants. Because if popular imagination is to be believed, peasants spent the entire Middle Ages permanently caked in mud, never bathed, and lived in a haze of smells so powerful they could be used as chemical weapons. It's a comforting stereotype in a way. We like to think of the past as dirtier than today. It makes our daily showers and deodorant feel like a triumph of civilization. But tonight, let's settle into the quieter reality. Were medieval peasants really always dirty? The short answer, not exactly. The long answer, Well, it depends on which peasant, which century, and how generous the local stream was feeling. First, let's talk about bathing. Contrary to the mud-covered image, medieval people did bathe. Not every day, of course. Soap companies weren't yet running advertising campaigns about freshness, but enough to matter. Bathhouses existed across medieval Europe. Towns had public baths, often heated, where men and women gathered, sometimes separately, sometimes not. These baths weren't purely for hygiene. They were social hubs. People went there to talk, eat, even conduct business. And yes, in some cases, business of a more scandalous variety, which is partly why the church grew suspicious of bathhouses, seeing them as gateways to sin. But the fact that they existed at all tells us peasants and townsfolk alike valued washing, even if priests grumbled about it. And then there's the countryside. Rural peasants didn't have marble baths, but they did have rivers, ponds, and buckets. Washing clothes in the river was a regular chore, and it's hard to imagine women standing ankle-deep in freezing water without also splashing themselves clean now and then. We even have records of medieval lords complaining about peasants using too much water from the manor's supplies, proof that they weren't all content to wallow. Soap did exist. Early medieval soap was rough, made from animal fat and ashes, but it worked. By the later Middle Ages, finer soaps were imported from the Mediterranean, made with olive oil. So no, peasants weren't scrubbing with lavender-scented body wash, but they weren't strangers to lather either. Clothing is another detail. Popular imagery shows peasants wearing the same filthy tunic for decades. In reality, they wash their clothes, perhaps not daily, but often enough to prevent disaster. Linen, the most common fabric for undergarments, was relatively easy to clean. In fact, it was prized precisely because it could be boiled, beaten, and bleached in the sun. Medieval paintings often show women hanging laundry in fields, which tells us this was a regular, even ordinary part of life. And yes, peasants owned more than one set of clothing. Not dozens, but at least 2 or 3, which meant you could wash one set while wearing another. Revolutionary, I know. So why do we imagine peasants as filthy? Partly because later writers, especially Victorians, enjoyed exaggerating the squalor of the past. It made their own era look shinier, and partly because peasants really did live hard lives. Dirt was everywhere. Houses had earthen floors, often covered in straw that doubled as bedding. Animals sometimes lived under the same roof, particularly in winter. That didn't mean people never cleaned. It just meant that clean looked different. For a medieval peasant, cleanliness wasn't about smelling like roses. It was about not dying of infection. Washing wounds, scrubbing utensils, boiling water for cooking. These mattered more than daily showers. Dirt on your tunic was normal. Rotten food scraps attracting rats, less acceptable. And then there's the church again, quietly complicating things. Bathing in moderation was fine, but too much bathing? Suspicious. Priests worried that hot water opened the pores and let sin seep in. Some even claimed frequent bathing encouraged lust, which meant that, depending on where you lived, bathing might be gently discouraged, not because it was dirty, but because it was morally risky. Of course, wealthy nobles ignored this advice. Kings had personal baths hauled into their chambers. Monks had rules about weekly bathing, which suggests that cleanliness wasn't absent. It was just tangled up in religious anxieties. Peasants also had their own standards. Head lice, for example, were common. People used combs to pick them out, and sometimes herbs or vinegar rinses. Medieval records mention remedies for fleas and bedbugs, which suggests people weren't thrilled about sharing their mattresses with insects, even if they couldn't fully prevent it. And smells? Well, yes. Without modern plumbing, medieval villages had plenty of aromas. Manure, smoke, sweat, and stagnant water were part of daily life. But it's worth remembering that everyone smelled similar. You only notice a bad smell if you're not used to it. To a medieval nose, a smoky cottage probably smelled like home. So, were peasants always dirty? Not in the cartoonish way we imagine. They washed, they bathed, they laundered, and they cared about hygiene. Just not in the way modern people do. Cleanliness was relative. For them, being clean enough to avoid disease and social embarrassment was sufficient. Nobody expected a peasant to sparkle. In truth, the dirtiest part of peasant life wasn't their bodies, but their reputation. Later centuries painted them as permanently filthy to reinforce the idea that the past was a swamp from which modernity heroically emerged. But if you dropped into a medieval village tomorrow, you'd likely find peasants who smelled faintly of smoke, soap, and livestock. Not exactly glamorous, but not unwashed monsters either. So no, they weren't always dirty. They were just medieval, which is its own kind of messy. And with that, let's brush the straw off our tunics, rinse our hands in the village stream, and drift onward to yet another quiet corner of history's long, uneven memory.